Good morning, everyone. Learning Mishna is Erevin, Parak Yud, Chapter 10, Mishnah Yud Beis, Mishnah 12. Quick introduction. The case of the Mishnah involves, I'll read to you from the introduction, the case here in the Mishnah involves the door of a closet or other freestanding structure. I'll call it a cabinet. That is held, and it's not connected to the wall. It's not connected to the house. It's not considered connected to the ground. It's freestanding. That is held in place with two pegs. The door of this closet is held in place with two pegs, one attached to the bottom of the door and one attached to the top. These pegs fit into corresponding holes in the closet itself above and below the door. The pegs swivel in their holes, allowing the door to swing open and closed. Now, that's the case here. What happened? One of the pegs fell out. And the question is, can you put it back on Shabbos? So the Mishnah reads, Machzirin tzira tachtem mikdash. You can put back the bottom peg in the Beis HaMikdash. Avaloi b'Medina, but not anywhere else, not anywhere else in the country, not anywhere else outside of the Beis HaMikdash. If the bottom peg falls out, you can't put it back in. In the Beis HaMikdash you may, outside the Beis HaMikdash you may not. V'ha'el yain, if it's the upper peg that comes out, kan v'kan aser, in both places, both in the Beis HaMikdash, both outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it'll be forbidden. Now, as we had yesterday, when we're dealing with rabbinic prohibitions, in the Beis HaMikdash, those rabbinic prohibitions do not apply. If it's a Torah prohibition, that applies in the Beis HaMikdash as everywhere else. So when the Mishnah starts off and says, if the bottom peg falls out, you can put it back in the Beis HaMikdash, that means that when the bottom peg falls out, the door is still really in place. And it doesn't take much effort to just basically gently put the bottom peg back into its hole. And therefore, there is from a Torah point, there is nothing wrong with that, putting that peg back in gently. If the top one comes out, then the whole door is out. That means you got to put the door back in. According to this opinion of the Mishnah, putting a door back into a freestanding object, putting the door back into the closet, it's considered a Torah prohibition of building. So even though there's not a structure, this is a freestanding object. The Tanakama, the first opinion here holds, yesh binyan b'kelim. The malacha, the forbidden act of baina, of building on Shabbos, applies even by freestanding objects, even by objects that are not connected to the ground. Even if you're not doing anything in a building or anything connected to a building. It's just a closet. Nonetheless, the prohibition of baina applies. So therefore, if the upper peg falls out, you got to put the whole back door in. You have to put the whole door back in. That would be considered an act of baina, Torah prohibition, and it's forbidden everywhere. If it's only the bottom one that fell out, so the door is still there, you just got to, the door is pretty much still there. It's still connected. You just got to put that bottom peg back in. So since you could just very gently and easily drop it back in, that's not considered an act of baina. Nonetheless, and therefore, it's not a Torah prohibition, and therefore we say to do that in the Beis HaMikdash is going to be permissible. Nonetheless, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, we say even putting that bottom peg back in is forbidden because we have a concern. You can actually take that bottom peg if it's out and, just gently kind of drop it back in, or you could actually bang it in a way that it goes back in firm. If you do that, if you bang it in, that should be in there firmly, that may not be building. It's not building, but it's a different prohibition. It's called makeh b'patish, putting on the final touches. Putting on the final touch to make something now usable, that's a Torah prohibition. And therefore, if you were to firmly put that bottom peg back in to the hole, that would be a Torah prohibition. Therefore, the sages forbade even putting it back in gently, lest you come to go and put it back in firmly. So even putting the bottom peg back in is a rabbinic prohibition. Therefore, in the Beis HaMikdash doesn't apply. Outside the Beis HaMikdash, it does. Even in the Beis, when we say that it doesn't apply in the Beis HaMikdash, we're talking about a closet, a cabinet that is needed for the avoda, for the divine worship. Let's say in this closet they store the salt. Let's say in the closet they store the kataris, the incense. So that is a need for the service of the Beis HaMikdash. That's where we say that the rabbinic prohibition is suspended. It's not going to be something that's in the Beis HaMikdash, but not really needed for the service itself. The rabbinic prohibitions would apply to. That's why here, commentaries speak out that we're talking about a closet in the Beis HaMikdash that's actually has a need for the purposes of the avoda of the divine worship in the Beis HaMikdash. So that's the first opinion. According to the first opinion, putting the upper peg back in, which means putting the door back in, is a Torah prohibition. You can't do that anywhere. Putting the bottom peg back in is a rabbinic prohibition. Therefore, the Beis HaMikdash, you're allowed to do it. And outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you may not. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ha'elyon, b'mikdash. If the upper peg comes out, you want to put it back in, that you can do in the Beis HaMikdash. Outside the Beis HaMikdash, you cannot. And if it's the bottom peg that has to go back in, you can even do that. You can even do that outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is, number one, Ein binyan b'kelim. The Torah's prohibition of building does not apply by utensils, not apply by movable objects like this closet. A freestanding object, if you have to put the door back in, is not a Torah prohibition of bona. It's a rabbinic prohibition. Even though it's permitted from the Torah, the rabbis still forbade it. It's a rabbinic act of bona of building. But it's a rabbinic act. It's rabbinic prohibition. It's rabbinic prohibition in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple, it's not a problem. Only outside. The bottom one, again, if you put it in gently, there is no problem of bona. There's no problem of makah b'patish. If I put it in gently, putting on the final touch doesn't apply. And Rabbi Yehuda does not agree with this concern that if we allow you to put it in gently, you'll put it in firmly. He doesn't agree with that. And he's not concerned with that. And therefore, according to him, even if the bottom peg comes out, you can even put it back in, outside of the Beis HaMikdash. There's no rabbinic prohibition there whatsoever. The Bartenura says the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda. That means halacha is like the first opinion, that therefore putting the upper back in would be forbidden in the Beis HaMikdash and outside the Beis HaMikdash. Putting the bottom peg back in is permissible in the Beis HaMikdash and only forbidden outside the Beis HaMikdash. Have a wonderful day.